Now, we recently read an interview that you did with the Economic Times where you mentioned China's troubles could be a good thing for India. I think the quote was along the lines of the macro narrative is probably the best that we have ever had. Wow. Huge
Bullish.
claim, huge claim. So I guess the question is, whoa, can you actually help us unpack your thinking here?
Sure, sure. So look, I mean, I'll put it. I'll give you the superficial way to read that comment. Superficial way is we are at the top of our rate hike cycle. America's hiked by 5.5%. Indian central bank has hiked by 2.5%. And even though we are at the top of the rate hike cycle, economic growth is running at 6.5%. The stock market is close to all-time highs. Corporate balance sheets are in the healthiest shape I've seen them in the last 20 years. The banking system's balance sheet is in good shape. So when you're close to the top of the rate hike cycle and you're doing well on your macro metrics, that's always very encouraging, right? But there's a sort of deeper point I've been trying to make in India. If I look at India's challenge over the last 20 years, right, it's fundamentally been around China absolutely hammering the Indian manufacturing community, right? It's historically it's been impossible for Indian manufacturers to deal with Chinese manufacturers. Chinese manufacturers had cost of capital of 3-4% because that was the rate at which the Chinese government-owned banks would lend. And much as I would like to see cost of capital fall in India, I refuse to find it believable that a developing economy like China or India can have cost of capital at 3-4%. So the blow up in the Chinese banking system, I think, has rendered that construct unviable. The sort of trillions of dollars of cheap capital that the Chinese banks gave to Chinese companies who would then undercut Indian manufacturers, I think is now out of the picture. Right? That's the first thing to consider. A whole generation of Indian manufacturing has been wiped out. I'm seeing that revival in the last 3-4 years. It's very interesting. Companies that were created in 1975 in India almost died by 2015, and in the last 4-5 years they're reviving again as the Chinese products no longer are price competitive vis-a-vis the Indian products. Right, that's quite remarkable. For the first time in the last 20 years, Chinese products are no longer price competitive with many of their Indian counterparts. The second challenge India has historically had is our infrastructure was weak compared to China. China put a lot of money into infrastructure, lots of highways, lots of super fast trains. We haven't invested as much. It now turns out many of China's infrastructure projects seem to be white elephants, and the banks that funded them are in trouble. In contrast, in the last decade or so, India has almost tripled its highway network, quintupled its airline network, grown broadband connectivity at 80x. So our infrastructure isn't perfect. It's not, I would say, it's not a Japanese or European standards yet, but our infrastructure is materially, tangibly better than it was a decade ago. Trucks are moving at twice the speed that they used to move at 10 years ago. Working capital cycles are therefore crunching, and our laggard status on infrastructure, I think, has been remediated considerably. And the third piece was dumping, right? Even as I look around the room, right, many of the things in my room itself are Chinese made, right, including the laptop through which I'm talking to you. Historically, because of the way China dealt with the WTO regime, it was very difficult to stop dumping of Chinese technology products of a range of Chinese manufacturers. In the last 3-4 years, I think not just India, I think many other countries, the United States included, have taken a harder line stance on dumping. And therefore, as the incidence of dumping reduces, we are seeing local manufactured companies coming to the fore. For example, Apple has decided that a quarter of the iPhone production and iPad production will move to India. I think Apple makes $220 billion of iPhones and pads. A quarter of that moving to India is a big deal. So that's what I meant by that fact that events in China and the way China is playing out finally is allowing Indian manufacturing specifically to find its place in the world.
Just some of those stats that you were talking about there, tripling your highway network, 80 times the broadband penetration, 4 times the flight penetration, or whatever the numbers were. It must just be fascinating to be living in a country where like development is happening that quickly. And so Bryce took a gap year in India back in, 2011, 2010?
2010, yeah.
So a bit more than a decade on from when Bryce was there, like how much would have changed in a decade? Like give us a sense of just how quickly things are changing over there.
So let's take an example of airports, right? Every single airport that I use for my travel around India, every single airport is less than 12 years old, right? Um,
So every airport in the country, Bryce wouldn't have been to any of them because he was there
Yeah, so
13 years ago.
he would have been to the older version, right? He would have been to the older version of the airport,
Okay.
right? And by the way, the result of that is because these are all modern airports, their ability to handle traffic is at a different level to say what I see when I go to America. Going to America is actually really painful now because the airline experience, the experience of traveling around America, or indeed the experience of using London Heathrow, is quite sort of shocking or shambolic to many Indians now compared to what we see in airports in India, right? The second thing which you'll notice is um, almost nobody in India in the cities uses cash anymore, right? So I hardly ever
Oh
go to the
yeah.
ATM. So whether I'm paying the local three wheeler, so we travel around in three wheelers for short hops, right? Whether that guy, he will not. If I offer him cash, he will think I'm something wrong with me, right? The guy selling coffee on the streets, tea and coffee on the street outside, he will not take cash. We all pay each other using our phones. So we've got something called UPI, the Unified Payment Interface. So if Bryce came to India, Bryce will go out with me for a cup of coffee. Bryce will scan using his phone, using the camera on his phone. He'll scan into the coffee vendor's bank account, say 25 US cents, and that's how money is paid, right? So 51% of GDP goes is now transacted using UPI, which is phone to phone transactions.
That was a major push from the government, wasn't it, to try and get everyone to start actually using digital payments because so many people were using cash that the lost revenue from a tax point of view
Absolutely.
was so significant that they just didn't they force the currency so that like the minimum note size was so large that the smaller sort of change became obsolete and forcing people into digital.
Absolutely. So I think it's been carrot and stick. So the carrot that the government has held out for the entire country, and it's taken 12 years to build this platform, right? To build the platform, every Indian has had to get a bank account, a unique ID. The bank account and the unique ID have had to be mapped onto 1.5 billion people's phones. So it's been a massive infrastructure
Jeez.
build out, right? But alongside that, the carrot that the government held out was if you guys do this, it becomes far easier for you to do tax compliance, right? So when we fill our income taxes in each year now, a lot of it is just auto filling because all our data. So, for example, whatever I'm transacting in the stock market, my unique ID is being locked into that. So the taxman knows even before I filed what I've made in the stock market, what the capital gains on that are. Similarly, every time I buy a cup of coffee, because my phone is locked into my unique ID, the government knows that I've bought that cup of coffee. So does my bank, right? So the positive side that the banking system and the government is saying is, if we can monitor you and track you, will give you credit at much lower rates. The biggest surge in credit in India, the biggest surge in bank lending is unsecured finance to small vendors selling juice and burgers and driving around in three-wheeler rickshaws. So the small SME owner is getting credit at a rate that he couldn't have dreamt of, Bryce, when he came to India 11 years ago. You could argue that there's a curtailment of civil rights because Big Brother is watching you. Every transaction is now inside this whole net uh, of uh, of big data. But that's, I think, that's the way I guess a country develops, right? So our indirect tax system also locks into this. The indirect tax system is also locked into this whole digital web. The banking system, indirect tax system, and our entire big data interface locks into it. And that's how this country has sort of, I would say, leapfrogged many other emerging markets by a couple of generations by making a jump from almost a country with 14% of GDP being cash transactions of 14% of GDP. We've gone to 51% of GDP being cashless transactions.